You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
Kevin, hello. I'm good. And hello to our listener. Thank you for joining us for another hour as we look at the world through a modern monetary lens. I'm good, Kevin, because I actually have a basin that is not clogged.
Right, yes. I've heard that you've had many domestic things happening in your house. The economy is working through various people tearing your place to pieces and putting it back together again.
I'm so glad to be part of the market forces, Kevin.
What I've noticed, as you're fixing things, other things are breaking. And so we have this inbuilt mechanism to keep the economy ticking over by attrition.
By the law of thermodynamics, which is hugely apparent in my place at the moment.
Indeed.
Anyway, it's first world problems, I could tell you.
As opposed to the discussion that we're having with our good friend James this week. What are we going to be listening to this week?
Well, Kevin, it's an interesting one because, as you might imagine, when people like us look at the world through MMT and we hear that a country has defaulted on its debt, I think we're likely to get very curious about what went on there, because we would start from the position that it would be very strange for a country to default on its debt if that debt is in the currency that the country issues. So, for example, if Australia has a debt that is in Australian dollars, it can always find the dollars to pay back that debt, so it doesn't have to worry about defaulting on the debt. But
just on that, I believe that Warren Mosler, who founded MMT with Bill Mitchell back in the day, had quite a bit of success. This is pre the Eurozone. There was talk about Italy defaulting on its debt.
At that point, Italy was issuing its own lira.
Its own lira. And everybody's going, Italy's having unsustainably large amounts of debt in lira. And Warren Mosler recognised that if the Italian government creates the lira, it can never run out of the lira.
That's right.
And that's how he made a fair amount of money, which was a very MMT.
A good application, isn't it, of MMT to make you millions?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't worry about the debts if they're denominated in your own currency. But if your debt is denominated in a foreign currency, so for example, if someone owed money in US dollars and they weren't the US, I have to say I might be very encouraged to hear that a country had gotten out from under an onerous debt by refusing to pay back the dollars.
Yeah, so we speak to a fellow called James this week, and he is having a look at Cambodia. What happened in Cambodia when the Pol Pot regime came in?
So James Rosier is a student of MMT here in Melbourne, and Cambodia apparently defaulted on its debt, but as we shall hear from James, all is not as it seems. And it's painful that it seems like we are afflicted with these genocidal horrors repeatedly, and of course the present day is no exception when we look at Palestine. And our listener might be aware that between 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime undertook a genocide against its own people. And somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million Cambodians, or nearly A quarter of the population was killed. And this is the time of history that James is going to take us to, but we're not so much going to look at the geopolitics, but at what happened to the monetary system under the Khmer Rouge, given that they seem to operate on the doctrine that money is the root of all evil. And Kevin, I would have thought that the belief that you can create a world that you want through mass killing would be the root of all evil. But I guess these genocidal regimes have their own ideas about good and evil.
And the reason that James is having a look at Cambodia is that when you push a monetary system to its extreme, it's almost like a scientific exploration of what makes that monetary system work. Why did it fail? It's a good way of investigating what was holding it up in the first place. And what we see time after time is you see there's a misunderstanding of what constitutes a monetary system, and through that misunderstanding and through external interference, you see the whole thing unravel. It's fascinating.
It is. So join us as James Rosier takes us into this very fascinating moment in history. It is with great pleasure that I welcome James Rosier to Radio MMT. Thank you for joining us, James.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Kev and I, we know you from our monthly gatherings at the pub. And I just thought I would mention that because anyone who is listening who happens to be in Melbourne on the fourth Friday in the month could join us, and then they would get to meet you, James.
It's a nice soft way to introduce yourself to MMT if you want to join a group. Rather than commit to study, you can just come and drink with us.
And in fact, speaking of doing studies, economist Stephen Hale and his crew have gone on to create a course called Masters in Sustainable Prosperity, which they do through their organisation called Modern Money Lab, which you can Google. And they do that out of Torrens University, but it is an online course that you can do from anywhere in the world. And I do believe, James, that you have signed up for that course.
Oh, yes, I have indeed. It's sort of taken over my life. I thought maybe I'd do one or two subjects, and probably best part of the way through a diploma, maybe we'll end up with a master's. I'm not quite sure yet.
So you can do building blocks with that course.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, what got you so motivated around learning this kind of economics, this modern monetary theory and this ecological economics, which are our two favourite kinds of economics? What got you so motivated that you're prepared to spend all this time and blood and sweat and tears doing this course?
Well, I'd say it was sort of little by little and then kind of all at once. I think it was 2020 when I happened to just catch an interview. I think it was Phil Adams' Late Night Live with Bill Mitchell, and he was talking about this kooky theory called MMT, which I hadn't up until that point heard of. I was intrigued enough to want to find out more because although I was skeptical about some of the things that Bill was saying, I kind of realized that the implications of what he was saying, if he was correct, were pretty large for my values. Essentially that a monetarily sovereign country such as Australia is not financially constrained. And although I was broadly of the opinion that we shouldn't be constrained for ethical reasons, the technical reasons for that were kind of new to me. And so that intrigued me to ask a few more questions.
Financially constrained being that the Australian federal government can't run out of Australian dollars.
That's right.
So it kind of grew on you and you've ended up doing this course.
Yeah, that's right. I was working in thermal efficiency, fixing houses.
The energy rating sort of that they put on houses, etc., 5-star, 6-star, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I was doing projects around that. Some of the projects were state and local government run around improving the energy efficiency of homes for what was called the energy stressed. So people who had difficulty affording their energy bills, which is, it's effectively all of us these days. And as those projects were winding up, I was looking around for something else to do. and then the master's course kind of slotted in there. Made a lot of sense.
If you're involved in energy efficiency and you're dealing with the end of the market, which is having trouble affording energy efficiency, then I guess MMT directly speaks to a lot of those issues, because it gives a solution, which is to say, if the resources are available, we could fund these projects, which would be of long-term benefit.
Well, indeed. And in fact, the people that we were serving in these projects were quite a different cohort to the private clients. So typically the people who would get energy efficiency for the home are not the very poor, for obvious reasons. And they're often not the very rich, because very rich people tend to not care about their energy bills, even if they're spending a fortune heating and cooling a mansion.
Yeah.
But this is an excellent space for governments to step in, because people on low incomes and renters and so forth just don't have good quality housing. I think prior to MMT, there was that niggling feeling that the line of how we're going to pay for it, that there might have been some inherent truth to that. And I think MMT comprehensively knocks that kind of logic down. It doesn't knock down the real world problems of how we're going to resource given projects, what kind of labor and materials are going to go into that. But in terms of whether we can afford for people to live in homes that are healthy and so forth, that's kind of a moot point.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
So, James, my understanding is that your class at this Masters of Sustainable Prosperity, the students were given an assignment in which you are asked to choose a country that the received wisdom tells us has at one point defaulted on its national debt, and then to look into what happened.
Well, that's right. So there were various countries in a database that was compiled by the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England that had defaulted for one reason or other on their national sovereign debt. MMT sort of tells us that there's no technical reason why a country should have to do that, but the commonplace neoclassical interpretation would be that, well, these countries got too far into debt and their debt was unsustainable. And so what we did was we scurried off in all different directions and investigated all these little countries, and I at random ended up with Cambodia.
With Cambodia. So I guess this idea of a country defaulting on its national debt, you'd hold these countries up as a lesson in what bad economic management looks like, and it's supposedly very frightening because it means you're about to send your country into chaos and ruin.
Yeah.
And so, as you're saying, it'd be a very curious thing, because if a country is issuing its own currency, MMT would be telling you that a country like that never has to default on its debt. As long as that debt is payable in the currency that it issues, it can always pay the debt.
Yeah, that's right. And to cut a long story short, effectively what we found is in most of these situations, something that's occurring is pretty extreme. You've got cases of war, revolution, or some outside force kind of demanding that a country defaults. In my particular case, Cambodia, it's quite unusual because the country, in the words of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, was they decided to abolish their currency. And that's entirely unusual. And then reframing that in the context of MMT obviously became very, very interesting. So that's what I was looking into.
Wow. Here's a country that got rid of its currency. What happened during this moment in history where, what was it, the Khmer Rouge regime had gotten into power? There they are, defaulting, getting rid of money. What actually is going on here?
Okay, so I might wind back a couple of steps. to get a little bit of the context there. So in the period prior to this time, there was the Vietnam War in the adjacent country, and the United States is effectively dropping the largest amount of explosives ever that have been dropped on a country on Cambodia, because the Viet Cong were using parts of Cambodia as part of their supply lines. So in 1970, the Prince of Cambodia was deposed by one of his generals, Lon Nol, who then went on to kind of align himself with the US.
Is this one of these typical US-backed insurgencies within a country to overthrow the existing regime?
To be honest, it's not clear to me. There are certainly those who believe that the coup was organized by the US. But what this situation set up was the Communist Party, which had been a very small force up until that point, became aligned with the royal forces that had been deposed. And when the US finally pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, the Communist Party, or as they were also known, the Khmer Rouge, took the opportunity to take power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when they did, they brought in all kinds of, let's say, unusual ideas, even for, Marxist revolutionaries. Their particular take on this revolution was quite different.
They obviously weren't taking their orders from Moscow, is that right?
So they did have dealings with other communist regimes around the world, and some of their exports went to those other countries. But as you can imagine, they had different ideas about how their countries should be run, and they decided that basically all dwellers of the major city centres should be evacuated into the countryside. And they wanted them to live this kind of year zero existence on the land, working the land, and producing for the country.
So that was their idea of getting rid of the bourgeoisie or something, was it, just to kick everyone out of the cities?
Effectively, yes. And I think they held deep suspicions for anyone who were in the cities, because they may or may not have been associated with the former regime. But it's important to point that they were highly suspicious of pretty much any group that wasn't themselves. Their former allies, the Viet Cong, they turned against any internationals. They certainly turned against any expatriates who came back to the country looking to see how the glorious revolution was going on.
Wow.
And they effectively started a war against their own people.
Oh, so sad. It was such a horrible, yeah.
But the key point that we're looking at here is what they did with the money.
Right.
It's actually really interesting that there was a bit of a dispute in the Khmer Rouge about whether they wanted to get rid of money. There's actually some Khmer Rouge notes that were printed and in the early days of the regime were distributed around some of the provinces. But they had a big conference quite early on where it was decided, yes, that the corrupting power of money was something that they wanted to get rid of. And so they effectively abolished the local currency, which was called the riel.
The riel, is that R-I-A-L?
R-I-E-L.
R-I-E-L, okay. The riel. The riel is no longer real.
That's right. Yeah. That meant that any coins people had, any notes that they had, or anything that was denominated in the riel up until that time was effectively null and void. If you can imagine someone, perhaps they've got notes, perhaps they've got a bank balance, perhaps there's balances at their central bank. All of those just get a line straight through them, and they effectively disappear.
Hello, I'm Philip Lorne. I'm adjunct professor at Torrens University, and you're listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev on 3CR Community Radio.
James Rosier, student of MMT.
So the thing about this is that for those who are listening, they might be considering, well, Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical about money, and this actually sounds like a good idea.
I'm one of those people, actually.
Kev and I have argued about this a few times.
Yeah, and I might have some bad news for you,
Oh, dear.
Big Kev,
Okay.
for a couple of reasons. But then again, for anyone who's listening who's also thinks this sounds horrible because they're into MMT and they think the idea of having a monetary system is actually very useful, well, I also have some bad news for you.
Oh, okay. You're not pleasing anyone today.
Yeah, well, essentially, the system was a disaster, and the reason it was a disaster were legion. However, their conception of money was probably so off that they didn't really understand what they thought they were abolishing. It came to be my conclusion that although they abolished the real, which was the local denominated currency, they still had systems of credits. They still did international trade with credits and debits on international books. And they had a system of labor that could, in some ways, be thought as sort of a rudimentary money system. So they effectively didn't solve any of the problems that they thought they were solving, whilst also having a far more inefficient version of a money system in place.
And so I'm wondering, I'm trying to get into the Pol Pot head if that's possible. And what was it that he didn't like about money? And do you have even a sense of what they thought it was? Like, were they going down the commodity money track where they're equating money with a resource instead of seeing it as the ledger that mobilizes resources?
I would hazard to say they thought, probably like a lot of people, that money was the physical stuff, the coins and notes that we hold in our pockets and wallets and, take in and out of banks and into shops and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We use the phrase money interchangeably with that physical stuff as much as we do with the things that only exist in bank accounts. A lot of people believe that this is where money came from, those physical coins and notes. But the reality is that most money that's existed through history has existed on the accounting books of various governments and local authorities more so than it has the physical stuff.
Numbers in ledgers, which is a far more accurate description of money rather than gold coins and that sort of thing.
Which are just the tokens that represent that, yeah.
And that's right. And as we know, those tokens are kind of a portable version of those, credits and liabilities.
What I'm finding interesting about this is that there's such a large emphasis on money and not such a large emphasis on real resources. And the relationship between the two is something which constantly fascinates me. So seeing a country like Cambodia that abolishes its currency but still needs to access real resources, both internally and internationally, like they're going to be importing stuff. What happened there? Like, what could you see happening to this relationship when they abolished their currency?
Okay, so prior to the Vietnam War, Cambodia was very self-sufficient in terms of its food security. In fact, it was, I believe, the 5th largest exporter of rice in the world. But the wartime destruction, partly through the US bombing campaign, destroyed much of that facility. When the Khmer Rouge took to power, they effectively took all the means of production into states' hands, but the means of production in a fairly undeveloped agricultural system was entirely the labor that came straight from people. It wasn't machinery. It was very little infrastructure. Much of the infrastructure had been destroyed. So one of the priorities of the Cambodian government was to acquire capital from outside in order to increase their productive capacity. And they tried to achieve this through rice exports. So what they were doing was effectively driving the people into the dirt to produce as much rice as possible and then selling it to countries like Hong Kong, China, Yugoslavia, and so forth. And because they didn't have a local currency, effectively what they did is they would export, say, a certain amount of tons to China, that would go on a ledger in China, perhaps in the local currency there, and then that credit would be used to import whatever goods that they wanted to bring in from that country.
I just sort of became aware just recently that Norway runs a surplus, but that surplus is denominated in foreign currencies, and so it's a similar sort of situation where their ability to import is paid for with the foreign currencies that they accumulate through selling their rice, much the same as Norway would be selling its oil, and in also much the same way as Cuba used its sugar to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. So effectively, because they have money, existing out on these external ledgers, they haven't really abolished money, because with a credit understanding of money, we can see that this is effectively what they have, but there's just no physical currency coming back into the country. It just exists on a ledger somewhere.
But what we also know through MMT is that governments provision themselves by issuing currency and using that currency to acquire real resources. So Cambodia is presenting an interesting sort of situation where it's using foreign currency for importing stuff. But then I'm wondering how the Cambodian government provisions itself internally with a lack of currency. How does it utilise its local resources without a proper local currency?
Effectively, what they did is they assumed all property ownership and all output from any production that occurred. Then what they did was impose a liability on all workers. That is, they have to toil in the fields for X number of hours in order to get a certain amount of rice back. And that was typically inadequate. But effectively, you can look at that as a type of ledger.
Yeah.
So that's what MMT says, isn't it? That the basic form that money takes is as a ledger. There's a credit on one side and a debit on the other. And as long as you're tracking that kind of IOU system, then effectively you've got a monetary system.
You might want to look at as kind of a form of money, depending on your definition. But if you have a credit understanding of money that you can see, it's at least money adjacent. It's not very mobile. There's no sort of any market of any sort there, but I don't think markets have to exist for credit to exist, which is effectively what's happening here. Another way of looking at that is to say that the rice was a kind of currency there, but I think just looking at the labor ledger and, what people get out of that kind of makes a bit more sense to me.
It sounds like the government's provisioning itself with a exchange with its local population, labour for food and existence, with no excess currency being created to create a private sector market within the internal economy.
Yes, because the government assumes that any surplus from production, they then use that to go and whatever the priorities of the government was to import. And that really was their clear provisioning priority. They typically had fairly inadequate rations that didn't reflect, people's real world need. And so effectively what people did on the ground was hide, steal, and trade away whatever they could in order to survive.
So in the absence of a domestic market, I guess your material wealth would just plummet, and then you were scrabbling around to get whatever you could.
Yeah, effectively. I mean, a lot of the folks that came from cities and so forth were able to smuggle out, gold, precious jewels, US currency, or whatever they had, and they were able to trade that for extra rice. But this happened in a very ad hoc and unsystematic way. It was all very dangerous for all the parties involved. I've seen it described as the barter system of the Cambodian labor camps, but I think it's dangerous to call any of this stuff systematic. People were just surviving and they were sort of trading where they saw an advantage to do so.
It sounds like the domestic private sector market had been replaced with a local black market barter system. So if you wanted anything outside of your government provision, if you wanted anything more than what the government was going to provide in exchange for your labour,
More than your cup of rice.
You would have to exchange what you had to try and acquire any sort of provisions outside of what the government was giving you. So it's a very interesting example of how resources exchange once you remove a private sector market.
Yeah, and all of that stuff is quite fascinating, but it's again because the situation that people found themselves was so extreme. It's hard to draw any long-term conclusions about how any of this works or how it could work because it was a fairly short period.
So how long did this last for?
So they were only around for a few years. They started a war with Vietnam, and Vietnam effectively kicked the Khmer Rouge out of government. They fled to the periphery of the country, and there was effectively a guerrilla war running until the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And because the regime was so despotic and brutal, that the implications of how a non-monetary system would work, I don't think really apply. But as I was alluding to earlier, if you have these other sort of credit systems going on, it is contestable in the least to say whether they've actually gotten rid of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
Three CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
So, Kevin, not only does Cambodia have a reputation for having defaulted on its debt, but it has this reputation for having abolished its currency. And of course, that would be hugely interesting if it was true, because as the MMTers would say, that would give us an example of what it looks like when a national economy decides to get by without money. But I think James's point was that even within their domestic economy, you could still see a money-like system in operation, in that you have a central authority imposing obligations in order to get stuff. And presumably they were keeping some kind of record of these debts and credits. But of course, the problem is that if you call them, say, labour credits, they weren't very fungible. I just love that word, fungible, which means that they weren't interchangeable. They couldn't be used for more than one purpose. So this labour system of labour credits, it did not support a domestic market for the exchange of goods.
But the labour system that they have, though, is still a system of timesheets, essentially. They're recording work that's been done, and they would allocate a benefit. So all they're doing here is they're keeping all the records, they're keeping all the ledgers. Mm-hmm. They're still setting up an exchange system. Right. But they're trying to do it without a monetary system, and that's where it kind of gets interesting. You sort of go, you're still trying to do the same thing without the actual, with a kind of a different system of numbers.
You're still keeping a track of credits and debts, yeah.
Yeah, and I think where the confusion for the Khmer Rouge came when they tried to abolish the monetary system is that they're viewing money as having intrinsic value. They're viewing coins and notes and numbers like they're precious metals or something which has real value, when it's not. It's just an accounting system. It's just numbers.
And it's not just the value of it. They think that it is the essence of money, and by getting rid of it, you're getting rid of money. And of course, the coins and notes and so on, they're just the tokens. They're just the tickets that represent something.
Yeah. Thinking by that, removing the physical money, that you're going to change the whole system. It's kind of interesting. What I'm sort of realizing is, as was mentioned in that interview, I would love to see a post-monetary society, but
I know you would.
where and I'd like to see anarchy rule as well. But anarchy and a post-monetary system would require that your entire population are on board, that everybody's going to cooperate.
And hopefully not at the point of a gun.
Yeah, and what happens is that what you see with Cambodia is that they've abolished a capitalist system and then told those people, right, we're going to do this without money. Now, if everybody agreed, it would be fine. and this is where you see a good idea needs cooperation, and we are nowhere near that state of mind.
Okay, so that's the lesson that you draw from the Cambodia situation.
Yeah, except if you were here in this country 300 years ago, as I mentioned time and time again, there was a system where the population were cooperative and had no concept of a monetary system. And I'm fascinated by how that would have worked, because I think it's a really valuable and recent comparison that can be made.
Yeah. Something like that has to evolve, doesn't it, over many thousands of years? It's not just instigated overnight.
Yeah.
Here's a question for you. So the fact that we're calling what the people in the labour camps did barter, in other words, they were swapping stuff to survive, would you say that that undermines the MMT assertion that no society has ever operated a barter economy?
I wouldn't call it barter. I think that if you're operating under tyranny, if you're being forced to exchange your labour, that's not what you'd call a cooperative swapping of assets.
Oh, okay. So you're saying barter by definition has to be cooperative. I don't think it does.
I think barter means swapping. I've got this and I'm going to swap it with you for that. That to me is barter. So I think there has to be some degree of free will in there.
It's kind of an interesting point, and people can listen to our episode 21 where we talk about why the barter myth is actually a neoliberal idea that we all have to get out from under. See, I don't see the Cambodian story as proof that the MMT position is wrong, partly because, for one thing, their entire economy did not operate on barter. As we saw, they were using credits with international trade. And also, the MMT, as they always do, say that barter systems will arise in extreme circumstances, like these prison camps. And they arise when people are locked out of their monetary system. And so we expect to see this kind of bartering going on within the sort of context of there being a recent monetary system. And of course, the Cambodia situation, it didn't last long enough to supply any kind of evidence that barter could work successfully over the long term.
On top of that, I'd say that the Cambodian example actually strengthens the MMT point of view that the currency is used by governments to provision itself. And when a currency is removed, such as in this situation, the government has to revert back to tyranny. So what we're seeing here is the Khmer Rouge dismantling a system, not putting anything better in place. And so rather than going forwards, it goes backwards.
Let's head back into that awful situation that was the regime of the Khmer Rouge with James Rosier as our guide. So this idea that you had a labour obligation, I guess that fulfills the MMT understanding of, in order to mobilise resources, in other words, in order to get labour to do the stuff that you want to do as a central authority, the MMT story is that you will instigate a tax on the population. And the next step down is to have slavery. So I guess this system was just one step above slavery.
It's very close to it. I mean, it is so coercive, the system. And we sometimes talk in MMT about the tax system being a coercive part of how it works. But this framework is so coercive that it is perhaps fairly indistinguishable from slavery. But you can potentially see how a system like this might be adapted or evolved into effectively a monetary system.
We had a conversation with Phil Lawn just recently, and he made the point that governments used to provision themselves through tyranny and slavery, and that was replaced with taxation as a way of coercing the population to provision the government. It sounds to me like the Pol Pot regime has wound things back to achieve the same purpose.
Yeah, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that MMT doesn't necessarily describe democratic systems. It only describes monetary systems, where they exist. We effectively are a part of the government processes in a democracy because we elect the government, and supposedly then we have some sort of input into who the ruling class is and what they choose to be the priorities when they're provisioning for government. Obviously, how far that goes is quite debatable, whether you believe that we have a real input into the way government runs. But effectively...
Russia's a democracy, technically, and it has a monetary system. China has a monetary system, and it's not a democracy. So,
it's worth pointing out that many of the other communist regimes kind of flirted with getting rid of their money systems.
Oh, did they? Okay.
And they, for one reason or another, decided that it was effectively too difficult. My understanding, and I'm no expert on Marx, but my understanding is that he's sort of talked about post-money systems, but didn't really explore them very far intellectually. And so many of the regimes that took their cues from him considered this idea, and Cambodia was the only one who actually tried to put one in place. Interviews with Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, expressed that one of his greatest regrets was not the death of perhaps 1.7 million people, but it was the attempt to abolish money. I think we should take anything that he said with a grain of salt, because it was well known to lie about everything, including his own personal history. But it's interesting that he sort of point that as a particular failing.
Yeah.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
One of the curiosities of the Khmer Rouge regime is that early on the National Bank of Cambodia was dynamited, and it's a bit contested why this happened. Some believe that was...
I sympathise, but anyway.
Yeah, some believe it was a policy because they were trying to wipe away all forms of currency, but others suggest that this was done in order to cover a plot to steal the gold that was in the National Bank. And so they were like, well, it kind of fits in with the overall regime. So certain people were able to smuggle out gold under the guise of getting rid of that physical currency.
Well, speaking of the inclination to bomb your central bank, I have to admit that I often feel quite exasperated by the world situation, and sometimes I will fantasize about these so-called global south countries, giving the IMF and giving the World Bank the middle finger by defaulting on their debts. And so I'm just wondering, as you looked at this example of Cambodia, and maybe we're discussing these different examples with the students at the Masters of Sustainable Prosperity course, did you ever talk about why defaulting on your debt deliberately might or might not be a good idea?
Well, so there's an interesting case from Cambodia because when they defaulted on their national currency debt by, effectively putting a line through anything denominated in real, they also defaulted on any of their external foreign denominated debts at the time. And one of these debts was an agricultural loan from the United States.
Oh, no.
Because much of Cambodia's rice infrastructure was smashed up because of the bombing and previous wars, a country that had once been self-sufficient needed to import a whole bunch of rice.
So sad.
They also did it at one of the worst possible times because it was occurring during the world food crisis. There was, I think, an El Nino period affecting grain production in Africa. And so at a time when Cambodia needed to import rice, all types of staple foods were going through the roof. And part of the way they funded this was with foreign loans from countries like the United States. When the Pol Pot came to power, they put a line through all of those debts. Many of their old debts from that period have subsequently been paid or written off by governments. But this specific debt to the United States is still around, effectively because modern day Cambodia refuses to pay it. They say that it's an old debt.
I've got to say, I mean, apart from anything else, if Cambodia has borrowed money from the US for agricultural development, and then the US comes in and bombs the shit out of them and blows up all the stuff that they had to borrow money for, I'd say, buggy, you're not getting paid back either. You blew up everything that we borrowed from you.
There's a bit of poetic justice in there.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's one of the great ironies of this is one of the reasons that they needed this was because one of the largest bombing campaigns in history, and has actually repercussions to this day about, some of their most fertile arable land. It's still covered in bombs that means that Cambodians have the highest amounts of amputee citizens in the world.
Jeez.
So as part of my project, I was looking into testimonies in Congress where various government officials were asked, well, why can't we just draw a line through these? And there was a bit of a back and forth between officials, but effectively these Treasury officials were saying, no, we can't put a line through a debt because we consider this an asset, and unless we get an act of Congress to say otherwise, then that stays on our books. And effectively, what was being pointed out was that actually acts of Congress put lines through debts all the time, whenever it suits the political powers to do so. Historic debts were written off in Iraq and Afghanistan and various other countries because it suited the United States to write those debts off when they were effectively, propping up those governments there. The funny thing is that Cambodia today was being treated as if it was some sort of dilettante and mismanaging finances. But those agricultural loans went towards food that was presumably eaten decades ago. And the benefits of those were, I believe, largely Thai and Japanese rice producers who would have been paid off, again, decades ago. So it's not like they were actively squandering an investment. The food was eaten or it disappeared in the theatre of war. And so all that's left are these ancient debts.
Which are simply numbers in computers.
Simply numbers in a computer, and all they need to do is put another line in there that says that we've written off this debt.
Well, is there anything more about the Cambodia story that we've missed?
There is so much, Anne. Like, we could go down so many rabbit holes. One of which is that Cambodia today is one of the most highly dollarized countries in the world, meaning that even though the riel came back with the Vietnamese regime, proportionally very little of it is used today. Some people have speculated part of that goes back to the trauma of when the all riel was wiped down, but I think it has a lot more to do with the UN coming in 1993 at the end of the Civil War. They brought in one of the largest UN operations in history, but also masses and masses of US dollars. Local systems weren't able to cope. And many of the systems that stayed around, NGOs, international firms continue to pay local people in US currency, which has had ongoing ramifications to this day.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, the main thing that I see from the MMT perspective is obviously that now they're operating an economy on a currency that they don't issue themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of classically non-monetarily sovereign. They're actually pretty good, if this is a skill, and I think it is, at pegging their currency to the US dollar. But that situation clearly favors certain vested interests. The government there is highly corrupt, with many officials owning properties around the world, including in Melbourne, that are valued highly in excess of what their known government salaries should allow them.
You're earning the equivalent of $10,000 a year and you've got $1 million mansion in Melbourne.
Oh, and more, and much more. Yeah.
Oh, wow. It's a fascinating story, and we probably could spend the rest of the year going through country by country to look at what goes on in these moments of defaulting on your debt, which I guess is just being unable or refusing to pay your international debt.
Yeah, what I find interesting about these stories, and you hear all these stories about hyperinflation and defaulting on debts, etc., it really exposes the relationship between real resources, sovereign currency, and interference from external sources. Once you start having a look at how that operates, it helps increase the understanding of the role of money. It's fascinating stuff.
And it highlights the power games that are going on as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Yeah.
And I know you're in the throes of continuing this course, so best of luck with it. We can't wait until you're a fully fledged economist.
Oh, yes, whatever that means. I don't know if I get a special hat that says economist on it.
Wait for the revolution. Wait for the revolution, James, and we'll put you in a worthy position.
Yeah, that's right. We'll put you in charge of the central bank.
We were just talking about a revolution where people were being put in all sorts of positions that I maybe wouldn't want to be in.
Yes.
All right. Thanks again, James.
Yeah, good on you, James. Thanks, mate.
Kev, Anne, pleasure.
This is Bill Mitchell. You're listening to my favourite Melbourne radio station, 3CR, with Anne and Kev. Great program, great guests.
You know, Cambodia's debt default reminds me that there are always two sides to a debt-credit relationship. In other words, the Khmer Rouge might have thought on their side that they were abolishing this debt to the United States, but from the point of view of the United States, that debt is still on the books.
So now when Cambodia wants to deal with the US, there's these numbers on these books. It shows the ridiculousness of the whole thing, because Cambodia is not going to acknowledge that debt. The US keeps it on their books because it's seen as an asset.
And also they've got no institutional way of wiping it off without a lot of trouble.
Yeah, so these numbers exist. They serve no purpose.
No.
They don't do anything. They just exist on computers for no reason whatsoever, because people can't get their heads around it.
We should stop being afraid of these numbers.
Yeah, and as was mentioned, the US can, when it wants to, when Congress allows, just wipe these numbers out. They can create them and they can make them disappear just as easy as that.
I heard an example of that recently on the podcast Geopolitical Economy with Michael Hudson, where he was pointing out that the US and I think other Western countries have recently forgiven about 40% of Ukraine's debt.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? They can suddenly wipe it off like that.
They can just say, yeah, it's okay. That displays that people are stuck in this mindset that if the numbers exist, they can only be wiped out through proper processes. They can't just disappear. If they can just disappear, that means that they're not really real. It's just a concept.
Well, they're abstract. They have real effects, but they're abstract.
They're abstract. A coin has a number on it. It's the number on the coin that's the important thing.
Part, that's right.
Yeah. And so you can imagine it into existence and then you can give it a physical form, but it is just a concept.
Well, it's an agreement or a social relationship.
Yes.
So what we have is the banks of England and Canada. They went and did this survey of these countries who had defaulted on national debts. And at first glance, you might think that Cambodia had defaulted on their debt because they abolished their currency. And yes, they might have abolished their currency, but they did not entirely get rid of money because remember that currency is a special form of money. So all money is what the economists call a tradable IOU. So for example, if I wrote on a piece of paper, I owe Kevin 1 beer, and then Kevin took that piece of paper and he went to Vicky from Mafalda, who are coming up next, and he said to Vicky, I'll give you this bit of paper if you'll come and press the buttons for Anne when I'm gone. Then you can see that that bit of paper is starting to behave like money. And of course, currency then is a specific kind of a tradable IOU, which is where a central authority makes a IOU that is also a tax credit. In other words, you can use this bit of paper that says $10 on it to pay off your taxes. And so if someone somewhere in the economy has got $10 worth of taxes to pay, then people will always want that money.
So what you're saying is that they're not going to use the IOU that you wrote me for a beer as part of my tax return. And that's essentially it, really, isn't it? Is it? Yeah, we can all create our own little currencies like you do with Monopoly. That's a currency. It's traded in a game. It serves a purpose, but it's not much good for anything else because if you roll up to the ATO with your Monopoly money,
there's another scientific experiment we can try.
Yes.
Yeah, and as we said, the Khmer Rouge did not get rid of a system of debts and credits, which are the bare bones of a monetary system. And so I don't get to make the case that getting rid of money inevitably leads to the killing fields, although that's kind of what I suspect sometimes.
Well, yeah, but I think we need to make this point. As soon as you say communist regime, there's this implication that it's violent. But it's not that communism is violence.
I don't think socialism necessarily has to lead to a violent, dysfunctional society. But I still maintain that a socialist society probably wants to start out with a monetary system.
Yeah, probably. And then eventually, at some stage in the future, if you look at Star Trek, we'll evolve into a non-monetary system. Or if you want to go the other way, if you go back the other way, you could look at Australia and look at the indigenous population here, how they operated for tens of thousands of years without a monetary system. And that fascinates me, always will.
Well, on that note, Kevin, I think we're in slight agreement.
Excellent.
And we've reached the end of the hour here.
Rightio. Well, it's time to go then, Anne. We need to make way for Mafalda. So I'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.